The storm had begun its slow crawl down from the mountains hours before Elias Marek entered the world. Snow moved like ash in the wind, swirling through the narrow passes that led to the village, sealing it off from the outside before midnight. The houses here were built low to the earth, their windows narrow, their chimneys coughing black smoke into the blizzard. Inside one of them, in a room warmed by a roaring fire, a woman lay in the last moments of labor, her face pale and damp. Her breathing was shallow, her strength spilling away with every cry. The midwife, an old woman whose fingers shook from both age and the cold that clung to her joints, leaned over her, muttering prayers that barely rose above the sound of the wind pressing against the walls. Outside the door, men shuffled their boots in the snow, too afraid to enter. They knew what it meant when a storm came like this during a birth. When the child finally slid into the world, his cry was not the shrill wail the midwife expected. It was soft, almost a sigh, the sound of a breath caught in ice. She wrapped him quickly in cloth, but as she lifted him, a strange sensation traveled up her arms. The air between her hands and his skin felt brittle, sharp, as though the heat in her blood recoiled. She looked down, expecting to see the pale pink of a newborn. Instead, the boy's skin was an unnatural shade, a cold pallor, his lips tinged with blue, though the room was thick with fire's warmth. The mother tried to reach for him, but her hand fell to the bed lifeless. The midwife knew without checking that she was gone. The room was too warm for what happened next. When the midwife placed the baby in the wooden cradle, she noticed the basin of water on the table beside it. Moments earlier, she had used it to wash her hands, the steam rising from it in the lamplight. Now, as the child's small hand brushed the basin's rim, the surface went still, the gentle ripples locking into place. The steam stopped. Within seconds, the water transformed into a single unbroken sheet of ice. The old woman gasped, stepping back, but no one else saw. They were busy closing the mother's eyes, covering her with a sheet, speaking in low, heavy voices about the cruelty of winter. Word spread before morning. In the Carpathians, stories traveled faster than truth. By dawn, the neighbors were whispering about the strange quiet in the house, about how the fire had burned all night, and yet the room felt like the breath of a cave. Some swore they had seen frost forming along the inside of the window glass, spiraling in thin white veins, though the logs in the hearth crackled and spat. Others claimed they had heard the midwife muttering in the early hours, repeating a single phrase, "Water will answer him." The boy's father, Anton Marek, did not believe in omens. He was a man of soil and stone, hands thick with work, his faith grounded in what he could see and lift. He buried his wife beneath the frozen ground with no priest, only the sound of the wind carrying off his final words to her. But even he noticed in the days that followed how the child's breath in the lamplight came out heavier, denser than any man's in the cold. How the milk in the cup near his cradle formed a thin crust if left too long. He told himself it was winter's doing. Winter explained everything here. Yet the midwife avoided the Marek house after that night. She told no one of the frozen basin. She told no one how. When she first swaddled the child, she had felt something deeper than cold, a stillness, as if the tiny heartbeat in her hands pulsed to a rhythm older and slower than life itself. The villagers had lived through harsh winters and strange births. But this was different. They did not call it a curse, not yet. They simply kept their distance, watching from across the snowbound paths, measuring the boy's existence in the frost patterns that began to appear on their windows whenever he passed. By the end of his first month, the storms had eased. The ice on the river cracked open under the pale sun. But in the Marek home, there remained a different kind of winter, one that did not melt. The cradle stood near the fire, yet the wood beneath it felt cool to the touch. The baby rarely cried. His eyes, pale gray, almost colorless, seemed to follow the flicker of light on water whenever Anton carried him to the well. And sometimes when the wind fell silent at night, Anton swore he could hear tiny creaks like the sound of a pond icing over coming from the corner where his son slept. It would be years before anyone would speak openly of that night, years before the whispers hardened into suspicion. But the midwife, in her own mind, marked it as the beginning. She had seen life come into the world in blood and warmth, in pain and joy, but never in a breath that made the air shiver. She knew something had entered with him, something the snow had carried down from the mountains and left in the arms of a dying woman. And she knew it would not leave until it had taken something back. The boy named Elias Marek slept through his first winter as though he belonged to it. Outside, the snow thinned, the river thawed, and the first shoots of green began to break the soil. But inside that house, the air still carried the faint scent of frost, and the water in the basin beside his cradle, no matter how many times it was emptied and refilled, never stayed liquid for long. By the summer of 1895, the snow had long vanished from the fields. The river ran fast with meltwater and the hills breathed green again. Yet Elias Marek carried winter with him. He was 6 years old now, quiet to the point of unnerving, his pale eyes half-lidded as if he were always studying something just beyond the edge of sight. Children in the village no longer came to the Marek house to play. Those who had tried returned home unsettled, describing a strange heaviness in their limbs after being near him, as though a deep cold had settled inside their bones. The fathers laughed at such talk, but the mothers watched Elias from doorways when he passed, their hands unconsciously brushing the edges of their aprons as if to ward off a chill. He moved slowly for a child, his steps deliberate, as though measuring each patch of ground. When he lingered near puddles left by summer rain, something happened that no one could quite explain. The water would still as if holding its breath, and within moments a thin crust would spread across the surface, cracking faintly in the heat before vanishing just as quickly. Anton Marek worked the fields from dawn to dusk, leaving Elias to wander. The boy never seemed to sweat in the sun, and the heat never flushed his cheeks like it did other children. Instead, he stayed the same cold shade, the air around him faintly sharper than elsewhere. Some mornings Anton would find small patches of frost clinging to the well bucket, though the night had been warm. He told himself the old wood must hold on to the cold from deep underground, but a part of him knew this was not true. It was not the wood. It was the boy. That summer, a traveling priest came through the village on his way to the larger towns beyond the hills. He was old and half-blind, leaning on a stick as he blessed doorways and muttered words the locals barely understood. When he came to the Marek house, he paused at the gate and seemed to study the air. Elias stood in the yard holding a tin cup of water. the priest's gaze fixed on the cup, and Anton noticed the old man's knuckles whiten on the stick. Without stepping closer, the priest told Anton in a low voice to keep the boy from the river. He said water would obey him, and when it did, no one would be safe. Anton tried to laugh it off, but the words lodged in his mind, returning in the quiet of night when he heard the faint creak of wood by the cradle or the brittle sound of ice forming where there should be none. That August, the heat lay heavy on the valley. The river ran low, its banks lined with children skipping stones and chasing minnows in the shallows. Elias stood apart near the bend where the current slowed. He crouched, his pale fingers trailing just above the water's surface, and the flow beneath him seemed to falter. A thin ripple of stillness spread outward in a perfect circle, the movement of the river halting for a breath, then two, before it resumed as if nothing had happened. A few children noticed and whispered, but they said nothing to the elders. They had already learned that speaking of Elias made people's faces tighten and their voices drop. Anton tried to give the boy more work to keep him away from the water. He sent him to gather wood, to fetch grain from the mill, to watch the goats at the edge of the pasture. But no matter where Elias went, he found water. In the troughs, in the hollows of stones, in the jars by the door. And wherever he found it, he would stop and stare, as if listening to something no one else could hear. Sometimes Anton would see his lips move faintly as if answering. By the end of summer, a few villagers had begun to avoid the Mareks entirely. They remembered the winter he was born, the storm that sealed the roads, the death of his mother, the whispers about the basin of ice. They told themselves they were not afraid, only cautious, but the way they crossed themselves when Elias passed said otherwise. The priest had moved on weeks ago, but his warning lingered in Anton's mind. He could not shake the sense that his son carried a season inside him. A season that did not belong here, one that would not be tamed by warmth or time. The first leaves turned early that year, curling brown at the edges before September. Anton noticed the change but said nothing. On the morning he took Elias to the edge of the field, the boy bent to drink from a puddle left by the night's rain. Anton froze, watching as the surface stilled and dulled, a film of ice spreading in the heart of summer. Elias raised his head slowly, drops clinging to his lips like tiny beads of glass, and for a moment Anton thought he saw his breath. He told himself it was a trick of the light, but the unease that took hold of him was colder than any winter wind. It would not be the last time that summer betrayed its warmth in the boy's presence. And it would not be the last time Anton wondered if the storm that had brought his son into the world had never truly left at all. It was the second week of August when the village woke to the sound of wailing near the riverbank. The heat had been relentless for days, the kind that made the air shimmer and the soil crack. Yet the body they found did not belong to the season. It was a girl, no more than 7, lying on the pebbled shore as if she had simply stopped running and laid down to rest. Her skin was pale and unmarked, her small hands curled loosely at her sides. But when one of the men reached to lift her, he recoiled. She was cold, impossibly cold, her flesh stiff as if she had been pulled from a winter lake. There was no frost on her, no sign of ice anywhere on the bank. But those who touched her swore she felt as though she had been carved from frozen marble. The villagers carried her body to her parents' home in silence. The heat returned instantly to their skin the moment they left the river's edge, as if the cold had been a presence clinging only to that spot. The women began whispering before they had even reached the door. They did not speak Elias's name, but the thought of him slid into their minds like a shadow slipping under a door. For years they had told themselves their unease was foolish, that the strange boy was only strange, nothing more. Now the memory of the basin of ice, of the still puddles, of the priest's warning all returned. Anton Marek heard the news late that afternoon. He said nothing when they told him where the body had been found. The bend in the river where the current slowed, the same place he had seen his son crouching just weeks before. That evening, when Elias came in from the yard, Anton noticed something he could not explain. There were faint marks at the boy's fingertips, pale streaks that looked like burns, except they were not blistered or raw. They reminded him of frostbite, the kind men got on the high ridges when the wind stripped the warmth from their blood. But there had been no frost, no wind, nothing but the thick heat of late summer. That night Elias slept without stirring, but his lips moved faintly as if forming words. Anton sat beside the bed watching the boy's chest rise and fall, and leaned close enough to hear the whispers. At first they made no sense, fragments of sound without shape. Then slowly Anton began to make them out. The boy was describing water, the way it moved, the way it slowed when he touched it, the way it liked to stop moving when he stayed very still. His tone was calm, almost affectionate, as though speaking of a friend. Anton told no one what he had heard. In the morning, the villagers buried the girl in the shaded part of the churchyard. The priest who had warned Anton months ago was gone, replaced by a younger man who looked away when asked about the death. The official word was that she had drowned, though no one could explain how her body had remained preserved, her skin unspoiled by the heat. The truth was not spoken aloud, but it settled over the village like a thin layer of frost, invisible at first, but there all the same, waiting for the right light to reveal it. From that day on, children stopped playing near the bend in the river. Mothers kept their daughters closer. And Elias, though no one confronted him, seemed to wander there more often, as if drawn by a voice only he could hear. If Anton tried to stop him, the boy would simply wait until his father's back was turned and slip away. The cold that followed him was no longer something the villagers imagined. It was something they could feel in their bones when he passed, a quiet that did not belong to summer. It would be years before another body surfaced. But for Anton Marek, the night of his son's whispered dreams marked the moment he stopped believing the cold in Elias was just a trick of nature. Something inside the boy had a will, and that will had already chosen the river. By the following spring, Elias had begun spending more time in the cellar than anywhere else. Anton at first thought it was harmless, a boy's retreat from the noise of the house, a place to hide from chores or escape the glare of summer. But soon strange sounds began to rise through the floorboards after dark. They were not the creaks of settling wood or the scurry of rats. They were sharper, intermittent, like the brittle snap of ice fracturing in the dead of winter. At times there was a faint dripping too, though when Anton went down to check, The cellar floor was dry. The room was small and dim, its stone walls sweating faintly in the warmer months. Elias had cleared a space along the far wall, where several shelves now held rows of glass jars. At first they were filled with nothing but water, cloudy from the well. But over the weeks Anton began to notice small shapes suspended in them, a minnow caught in perfect stillness, its tail frozen mid-flick, a beetle trapped with its legs curled inward. Even a bird, its tiny beak open as if in a last cry. Each specimen was preserved with eerie clarity, no sign of decay, as though they had been plucked from the moment of life and locked in it forever. The jars were cold to the touch, the frost blooming faintly around the lids despite the air being warm and damp. When Anton asked his son about them, Elias answered with the same unnerving calm he had in every matter. He said the water liked to keep things, that once it learned to hold them, it didn't want to let go. His voice carried no malice, no understanding of cruelty, only a detached certainty, as if this were a simple truth about the world. But there was something in his eyes, a fixed intensity, as though the jars were not trophies but tools, practice for something larger. The villagers noticed Elias less in the fields and more in the shadowed edges of the stream, collecting water in small cups or bottles, sometimes carrying them home without spilling a drop. Once a neighbor swore she saw him reach into the shallows and lift out a fish that did not thrash or gasp, but hung limp, its body beaded with ice though the sun was high. She told her husband, but he warned her to keep quiet. People in the village had begun to treat the boy like a slow-building storm. Not dangerous yet, but something you didn't provoke. By midsummer, the cellar had earned a name among the few who had glimpsed it, the glass room. They spoke of it only in hushed tones, imagining what else might end up in those jars. Anton avoided going down there after sunset. The air below seemed colder at night, a stagnant cold that felt different from the mountain winds or the chill of stone. This was the cold of water robbed of its movement, the cold of time refusing to pass. Sometimes, lying in bed, Anton thought he heard faint, irregular tapping from beneath him, like fingernails brushing the glass from the inside. Elias grew taller but thinner, his skin still that pale, unchanging shade. He spoke less with each passing month, preferring the quiet company of the jars. On rare evenings when Anton coaxed him to sit by the fire, the boy's gaze would drift toward the bucket of water by the door, his fingers twitching slightly as if resisting the urge to reach for it. And when he did touch it, the surface would still completely, the light from the fire shattering into tiny, rigid reflections before the first thin cracks began to form. By the time the harvest came, the cellar shelves were almost full. The jars lined up in perfect order, each containing a moment of life stopped mid-breath. To anyone else they might have seemed morbid, but to Elias they were something closer to beautiful. He had learned, without being taught, how to make the water hold perfectly still. And though no one yet understood what that meant, the cold beneath the Marek house was growing, inching outward into the earth, waiting. When Elias turned 9, Anton decided the boy's life in the village could no longer continue. Whispers had grown louder over the years, and though no one dared accuse him outright, there was a tension in every greeting, a pause in every conversation when Elias walked past. The incident with the neighbor's goat, found standing stiff and lifeless beside the trough, its fur rimed with frost, had been enough to send 3 families to Anton's door in a single evening. They did not demand punishment. They demanded distance. The next week, arrangements were made to send Elias to a Catholic boarding school in Prague, far from the hills and the river. Anton told himself it was for the boy's education, but deep down, he knew it was an exile. The school was an imposing structure of stone and shadow, its high walls blotting out the streets beyond. The air inside smelled faintly of candle wax and damp paper, the floors echoing with the click of boots. Elias was placed in a dormitory with 20 other boys, though from the first day he was set apart. His silence unnerved them, his pale eyes seeming to rest on their cups at mealtimes rather than their faces. The city heat pressed heavy against the windows, but it never seemed to touch him. When the others complained of thirst after games in the yard, Elias would sit quietly, sipping slowly, his water never warming in the glass. Within weeks, rumors began to spread among the students. One boy claimed that during an argument the water in his cup had turned cloudy and cold the moment Elias looked at it. Another swore he had seen frost form inside his own metal canteen during a midday walk, though the air was stifling. Most dismissed these as tricks of the imagination, but small incidents piled up. A drinking jug in the dining hall turning icy, the wash basin in lavatory refusing to drain because a thin shell had sealed its surface. The staff began to notice, too. Father Novak, the school's priest and self-taught man of science, took a particular interest in the quiet boy from the mountains. He had a fascination for the unusual, especially when it could be bent into doctrine or proof of divine intervention. Novak called Elias into his study one evening under the pretext of confession. The room was dark but warm, a single candle burning low on the desk. On the table between them sat a simple bowl of water. Novak asked the boy to place his hand over it. Elias did so without question, his fingers hovering just above the surface. Within seconds, the candlelight fractured into a dozen rigid patterns as the water solidified, the faint sound of tightening ice filling the air. Novak did not recoil. Instead, he smiled faintly, the kind of smile that measured a possession. He told Elias that such a gift was rare, that God must have placed it in him for a reason. But the words carried no warmth. They felt like a calculation. From that night onward, Elias was summoned regularly to the chapel's crypt, a space far from the noise of the dormitory where the air was cool and damp. Novak began his experiments there, small at first, bowls, cups, pails, always with the same request. Still the water, and Elias always obeyed. As the weeks passed, the tasks changed. Novak introduced glass jars, much like the ones Elias had kept in the cellar back home, but now the contents were alive, small fish, their gills opening and closing in confusion, then stopping altogether. Mice lowered carefully into shallow dishes, their paws scrabbling for purchase before the glaze of ice sealed their fate. Novak took notes meticulously, measuring how quickly the ice spread, how perfectly the bodies were preserved. Elias did not speak during these sessions. He simply did what was asked, his expression unchanged, his pale eyes following the stillness as it claimed each subject. By the start of winter, the other priests knew nothing of what happened in the crypt. To them, Elias was simply a quiet boy, a little odd, perhaps too withdrawn for his age. But to Novak, he had become something far more valuable, a specimen, a miracle, and a tool. The priest's ambition grew with each session, and though Elias seemed content to follow, there was a change in the way he carried himself. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The boy was no longer just obeying. He was learning. By midwinter, the crypt had become more than a place of study. It was Elias's true home within the school. Novak called it the winter room, though no one else knew of it. A heavy oak door separated it from the rest of the basement, and a thick iron key never left the priest's pocket. Inside, the air remained frigid year-round, cold enough to cloud breath even in August. The stone walls wept faint trails of moisture which froze in thin sheets along the floor so that walking required careful steps. A single crucifix hung crooked over the far wall, its wooden Christ coated in a film of frost that never thawed. Elias slept there now, his narrow bed pushed into the corner beside a trunk of neatly folded clothes. There was no fire, only the dim light of a single lantern and the silver sheen of the frozen basins that lined the opposite wall. At first, Novak had visited only during the day, continuing his experiments and keeping meticulous notes in a small leather-bound journal. But soon he began arriving after night prayers when the rest of the school slept. He brought with him buckets of water drawn fresh from the river, carried by two older students he trusted. Sometimes he brought live animals, rabbits, pigeons, once even a stray dog. The process became ritual. Novak would place the animal in a shallow container, ensuring its body touched the water but its head remained above the surface. He would then instruct Elias to quiet it. The boy obeyed without hesitation, his pale hands hovering just inches from the water. Slowly the ripples stilled, the surface hardened, and frost climbed the animal's fur or feathers in delicate crystalline patterns. The stillness would spread until breath stopped. Novak always watched closely, counting under his breath, measuring the time it took for life to end. Then he would lift the animal from the ice, turning it in his hands as though inspecting a fine sculpture before placing it aside and making a note in his book. At times, Novak pushed further, testing Elias's control. He asked him to freeze only parts of the animal, a wing, a paw, half the body, to see if the creature could survive in that fractured state. The results were always grotesque, limbs shattered like glass when touched. Bodies twitched in incomplete paralysis before succumbing entirely. Elias's face betrayed nothing during these trials, but Novak noticed how the boy's breathing slowed, how his hands steadied, how his eyes never left the water until the stillness was complete. By the end of the season, Novak began to wonder about the limits of his pupil's ability. In his journal, he speculated about the effect on larger animals and on humans. But such experiments would require secrecy far beyond what the crypt could offer. Still, he prepared. The buckets grew larger, the basins deeper. He taught Elias to work faster, to call the stillness in seconds rather than minutes. The boy adapted with unsettling ease, his thin frame unmoving, his gaze locked on the surface as if conversing with it. In the dormitories above, life went on as normal. The other boys noticed only that Elias was rarely seen outside of lessons. They assumed he was being punished or tutored privately. Some envied him for escaping chores. None guessed that beneath their feet the cold of deep winter had been made permanent, and that within it, something methodical was taking shape. A practice, a precision, the sharpening of a gift that could stop a heartbeat without a blade. Novak, meanwhile, began speaking less to his fellow priests and more to himself, his mutterings echoing softly against the frozen stone. He no longer thought of Elias as a student. The boy was an instrument, one he had been chosen to tune to perfection, and soon he promised himself he would find a way to play its most haunting note. By the time Elias turned 12, the winter room had expanded. Novak had constructed a series of shallow troughs along the walls, each lined with polished glass and filled with water drawn from the river before sunrise, when it ran coldest. The boy now spent nearly all his waking hours there, moving from basin to basin, perfecting control over every ripple, every trembling molecule. His hands were small, pale, and unyielding. His fingers had learned to coax ice into forming with surgical precision. Animals continued to arrive, but Elias now experimented without instruction, testing limits, dividing the water into patterns that froze only partially, or twisted into jagged geometries that left bodies suspended in silent agony. Novak watched with a mixture of fascination and fear. The boy was no longer just following commands. He was inventing methods of control that Novak had never imagined. Mice frozen mid-leap, fish caught in spirals of ice, rabbits suspended upright as though walking, their legs locked in impossible angles. Each trial left Elias calm, composed, detached, and Novak began to realize that the boy's mind had taken a turn beyond his own influence. There was creativity in the cruelty, a cold, deliberate logic in the suspension of life. One evening, a stray cat wandered into the crypt, drawn perhaps by the scent of water or the faint murmur of life contained in it. Elias approached it cautiously, crouching beside the feline as if he were a painter poised over a blank canvas. His hands hovered, then pressed lightly against the water the cat pawed at. In moments the surface stiffened, the water creeping up its fur, encasing claws and whiskers. The cat struggled at first, a panic rising, then fell into stillness, suspended in crystalline perfection. Elias lifted the animal gently and placed it on a side table. Its amber eyes reflected lantern light, frozen wide in terror, and Novak realized with a chill that the boy had discovered a method of selective paralysis, a suspended agony that required no blade, no fire, no poison. Word of the boy's ability never left the stone walls. Outside, the school continued in routine. Teachers speculated about his silence, his strange habits, his pale, unreadable eyes. The other boys whispered rumors. Water that hardened at a glance, animals that stopped moving mid-step, frost that bloomed from nothing. No one dared confront him, and no one could explain what they suspected. Inside the crypt, Elias began keeping journals of his own, small leather-bound books in which he recorded times, temperatures, and the patterns he created. He noted which animals responded best, how partial freezes could be manipulated, and the subtle differences between moving water and stagnant. Novak read these notes with awe and unease. He realized that the boy was surpassing the limits of mere human understanding. Every night he left the crypt with the sensation that something had shifted, that the instrument he had begun to tune was now composing its own music. By the end of winter, Elias had learned to make the water obey in ways that were horrifyingly precise. A single touch could freeze a small animal completely, or leave it half living, half immobile, the distinction exquisitely cruel. He could manipulate the ice to curve around limbs, constrict or suspend. leaving flesh unbroken but movement impossible. Novak began to whisper to himself about the potential of the boy's power on humans, and the thought both thrilled and terrified him. But he dared not speak it aloud, for even he sensed that Elias was no longer a student to be guided. He was a mind that had taken its first steps towards something darker, something patient, methodical, and entirely unfeeling. Elias walked from trough to trough, the lantern casting long, still shadows on the frozen water. The crypt was silent except for the faint crackle of ice forming in thin layers, the only sound in a room where life was being held hostage in crystal. And in that silence, Novak understood that the boy was no longer merely observing death. He was orchestrating it, one frozen breath at a time. By 13, Elias had become almost entirely withdrawn from the outside world. The school above moved on with its routines, exams, and prayers, and games carried on as if nothing unusual existed below. But the crypt had become a kingdom ruled by frost and silence. Novak had begun introducing more complex experiments, bringing in objects that challenged the boy's control. Delicate glass ornaments, thin metal chains, even the waxed pages of books dipped lightly in water. Elias learned to freeze them without cracking, to suspend droplets in midair, to create patterns that defied gravity, the way ice formed around branches in the forest, but here guided entirely by his will. The boy's psychological state hardened alongside his skill. No longer did he flinch at struggling animals or cry at the failed experiments. He viewed each subject analytically, calculating the speed and distribution of the ice as if plotting a map. There was a growing precision in his method, a kind of silent artistry that unnerved even Novak. Once, after a particularly intricate trial involving a dozen mice in a shallow pool divided into a lattice of freezing channels, Elias sat back on the cold stone floor, eyes unblinking, and simply observed the frozen tableau. The animals were alive in parts, dead in others, trapped in crystalline limbo, and Novak realized that the boy had developed not just power but a philosophy of it. Control as cruelty, stillness as dominance. Novak began to experiment in reverse, asking Elias to thaw partially frozen creatures at precise moments, testing his ability to grant life selectively. The results were unpredictable and occasionally horrifying. Animals that had been suspended for minutes would move in jerky, unnatural motions, some unable to walk properly, others consumed by shock. Elias never expressed regret. He was curious, detached, and methodical. The priest made careful notes, secretly marveling at the boy's capacity to manipulate life itself. Yet with each passing session, he could not ignore a gnawing sense that Elias's understanding was advancing faster than any human comprehension could keep up with. The winter room itself began to reflect the boy's growing dominance. Frost crept along every surface, forming geometric patterns across the stone, glass, and metal. The basins became elaborate, interconnected circuits of ice and water. Drops suspended in midair, forming crystalline bridges that supported the weight of small animals. Elias moved through it as a conductor moves through an orchestra, guiding the silent symphony of frozen life with subtle gestures, his hands almost imperceptibly directing every inch of the crypt. The air remained unnaturally cold, his presence enforcing it, so that even the walls seemed to hum with the latent energy of his control. Outside, the school remained ignorant of what was happening below. teachers noticed only that Elias appeared smaller, paler, and quieter, as though he were fading into himself. Fellow students avoided him not from fear but from an unspoken recognition that something about him was profoundly wrong. Rumors spread, not quite believable but persistent. The boy who never touched snow without freezing it, whose footsteps left a faint frost in corridors, whose breath in warm rooms fogged and crystallized in seconds. Elias, for his part, was neither aware nor concerned with the gossip. His mind was occupied with experiments and understanding, with discovering the boundaries of what he could and could not control. Animals, objects, droplets, air itself, all became instruments to be studied, measured, and manipulated. The crypt had become a laboratory, a sanctuary, and a proving ground. Novak, watching from the shadows, understood that what they were creating together was no longer merely unusual or miraculous. It was dangerous, and it was growing beyond even his ability to predict. A mind whose cold, precise logic was now married to a power that the world outside could scarcely imagine. As winter deepened and the days grew short, the lines between life and stillness blurred. The frozen tableau in the crypt expanded daily, and in its growing complexity the first traces of Elias's psyche began to emerge in crystalline form. Patient, meticulous, unfeeling, and waiting for a moment when the world above would be ready, or helpless, to recognize the magnitude of what he had become. By 14, Elias's mastery over the frozen world had reached an unsettling precision. Novak no longer brought animals for testing. The boy had begun seeking out subjects himself, small birds nesting near the riverbank, stray cats that wandered into the village, even insects that flitted too close to the lantern-lit crypt. Elias approached each with methodical calm, observing, calculating, and then touching water or frost to impose absolute stillness. The process had become almost meditative, a ritual he performed with reverence and detachment. Each experiment left the subject suspended in a state of unnatural suspension. Alive, aware, yet unable to move, every limb and sinew held by invisible ice, every breath a suspended whisper. The crypt had evolved into a complex network of basins, troughs, and channels, each designed to test a different facet of control. Water was no longer mere liquid. It was a medium for geometry, for torture, for study. Elias discovered he could freeze one section while leaving another fluid, manipulate temperature differentials so that ice crept along limbs in jagged, controlled patterns, or isolate portions of an animal's body in crystalline prisons while the rest moved freely. A precision of cruelty no human mind had devised before. Novak watched in awe and horror as the boy's work surpassed the parameters of science, morality, and human understanding. The psychological shift was profound. Elias's eyes, once curious and pale, now held a measured intensity, a quiet assessment of every creature and object that came before him. There was no empathy, not in the conventional sense. He observed suffering as he would observe a chemical reaction, noting responses, patterns, limits. Novak feared the boy's mind as much as he revered it, recognizing that the detachment was not learned. It was innate, a darkness that had grown alongside his uncanny gift. The priest's own moral compass wavered as he rationalized the experiments, but deep down he understood that Elias was beyond guidance, already a mind shaping its own macabre philosophy. Novak began leaving notes for himself, documenting the boy's progress, calculating what might be possible with larger subjects, longer durations, and more intricate freezes. He imagined the potential of humans, but such thoughts were accompanied by a cold dread he could not shake. Meanwhile, Elias developed variations on his method, creating frozen forms that mimicked gestures, arranging animals in tableaux of suspended life, experimenting with movement within stasis, a precision of cruelty that bordered on artistry. Each session in the crypt was longer, colder, more exacting. Frost crept along walls and floors with unnatural regularity, forming crystalline patterns that reflected the boy's growing obsession with symmetry and control. The villagers continued their lives unaware, whispers of the strange boy now mingling with superstition. Some claimed to see him wandering near the frozen river at dawn, his footprints leaving no impressions, the air around him trembling with frost. Mothers warned children to avoid the boy, not knowing why, only sensing the unnatural cold that followed him. Inside the crypt, however, the boy's world was complete. Life and death were no longer binary, they were instruments to be shaped, frozen, suspended, and studied. Novak could only follow, recording and marveling, while understanding that what they were cultivating was a hidden evil, patient, methodical, and entirely detached from the world above. Elias's adolescence in the crypt was not merely formative, it was transformational. By the end of the winter, he had learned to command frost and water with such precision that life itself became a canvas of his design. Novak realized that the boy's mind had become a repository of cruelty, intellect, and control, all veiled beneath the innocence of his outward appearance. The silent, frozen laboratory beneath the school had birthed a mind that no one could anticipate, a mind that would continue to grow, perfect, and eventually seek a world large enough to match its capacity for calculated, chilling domination. By 15, Elias's abilities had begun to touch the edges of what Novak had once thought impossible. The crypt had grown into a labyrinth of basins, channels, and shallow pools, each designed to test a different nuance of control. Elias moved among them with deliberate calm, his hands hovering over water as if it were a living extension of himself. Small animals continued to arrive, but the boy now experimented with longer periods of suspension, learning how to leave a creature in a state of liminal life, frozen yet breathing, aware yet immobile. The smallest miscalculation could result in death, and he measured each outcome with quiet fascination, noting subtle tremors, changes in eye movement, or irregular heartbeats. Novak, recording observations, began to understand that Elias's mind had become something beyond morality, beyond ordinary human empathy. It was pure, deliberate curiosity applied to suffering. The boy's methods had grown ritualistic. Before every experiment, he would trace patterns in the frost, lines and curves that seemed to channel the latent cold of the crypt. Droplets suspended mid-air, forming lattices of ice, and Novak realized that these were not random gestures but deliberate preparations, as though Elias were establishing a framework of control before imposing it on living beings. The air itself seemed to bend to his will. Frost crept along the walls, forming geometric patterns, delicate and precise, each one a silent signature of the boy's presence. He was creating order from chaos, but the order was cold, merciless, and entirely his own. Elias's detachment from ordinary life deepened. He no longer spoke to classmates, no longer lingered in classrooms or at meals. Teachers noticed his absence but assumed illness or shyness. Villagers whispered rumors of his unnatural abilities, water freezing at his touch, frost forming inside warm rooms, birds caught mid-flight by invisible force. But most dismissed them as superstition. Within the crypt, however, he was fully alive, fully present, and fully engaged with the dark logic of his experiments. Novak observed the boy placing a rabbit in a pool divided into frozen channels, each limb suspended in separate ice, eyes wide, limbs rigid yet still alive. Elias documented the results in precise notes, detailing times, temperatures, and responses with the meticulousness of a scientist and the detachment of a predator. The psychological evolution was striking. Where once Elias had shown moments of hesitation, he now displayed complete control, a cold calculation that left Novak both fascinated and horrified. The boy had developed a philosophy of suspension, a belief that control, not death, was the ultimate demonstration of power. His experiments were no longer for learning alone. They were for mastery. Novak understood that Elias was quietly constructing a world beneath the school where life and death were instruments, and he realized with a chilling clarity that the boy's mind would continue to grow in secrecy, honing cruelty into an art form that the outside world could not perceive or anticipate. By the end of the year, Elias had transformed the crypt into a frozen tableau of his making, a silent laboratory of suspended life. Every basin, every channel, every droplet reflected his evolving methodology. Novak recognized that the boy was no longer just a student. He was a mind of singular precision and terrifying potential. A hidden architect of suffering, patient, methodical, and entirely detached from the human world above. The lessons of the frozen room were complete, but the legacy of what Elias had become was only beginning to take shape, waiting for a world large enough to test the full scope of his chilling abilities. By 16, Elias had begun to explore the limits of his control beyond the confines of the crypt. Novak, once a cautious observer, now feared for what the boy might attempt, yet could not restrain him. Elias experimented with the temperature of the air itself, noticing how frost would form on windows and lanterns in precise patterns. How droplets of rain could be held in suspension mid-fall, frozen in delicate arcs that mimicked the curvature of his hands. Birds perched in the rafters, insects hovering near flickering lamps, even stray cats wandering near the village, all became instruments of his quiet obsession. He tested the boundaries of their endurance, freezing and thawing with meticulous timing, noting which combinations of pressure, duration, and exposure produced the most precise suspension without outright death. The psychological transformation was as pronounced as the physical manifestations of his power. Elias no longer reacted emotionally. His mind had adopted a cold logic, as though empathy was a hindrance. Novak observed with both awe and unease as the boy methodically manipulated living creatures, every movement intentional, every breath and tremor documented. The crypt itself seemed to pulse with the boy's will, a silent, frozen extension of his mind. The air remained unnaturally cold, the frost spreading like a signature, a permanent mark of his presence. Outside, the village whispered of unnatural happenings, yet no one could pinpoint the source. Doors and windows frosted from within, fountains froze overnight, and birds were found suspended, motionless yet not lifeless. To the villagers, Elias remained a quiet, unremarkable boy, pale and withdrawn. But those closest to the crypt began to feel a creeping unease, a sense that the boy's influence was not confined to stone walls or shallow pools. By the end of this year, the foundations of Elias's methodical cruelty were fully established, and the boy had become something far beyond ordinary comprehension. A mind capable of blending innocence with precise, deliberate terror, waiting for the world to reveal its vulnerability to him. By 17, Elias's experiments had reached a terrifying subtlety. He no longer relied solely on basins and channels. Now the very moisture in the air became his medium. Drops clung to surfaces suspended in mid-air, forming fragile crystalline threads that could trap small creatures, insects, and even birds in delicate living webs of frost. Novak observed him with growing unease as the boy calculated each freeze with mathematical precision, timing the shifts in temperature to the second, observing the reactions of each living subject without a flicker of emotion. Elias had become entirely detached from human life above ground. School and village were irrelevant. His attention belonged wholly to the frozen laboratory he carried in his mind. The crypt had become a reflection of his inner world, ordered, cold, and entirely under his control. Frost crept along every surface, delicate and precise, like the handwriting of his intent. Each experiment reinforced his philosophy. Control, not destruction, was the ultimate measure of power. The villagers whispered rumors of strange frost patterns and unnaturally still animals, but no one dared investigate. Elias remained outwardly small and unassuming, his presence almost invisible, hiding the full scope of his chilling capabilities. Beneath that ordinary exterior, a mind had been honed into a tool of methodical terror, preparing quietly for the day when the world itself would feel the weight of his deliberate frozen dominion. By 18, Elias's abilities had matured into a near-complete command over cold and suspension. The crypt, now an intricate network of shallow basins, channels, and frozen lattices, had become an extension of his mind, each pool and trough a deliberate study in control. He experimented with layering frost over living subjects, creating delicate cages that confined movement while leaving awareness intact, observing reactions with detached precision. Small animals remained his primary focus, but he began exploring more complex patterns. How limbs could be isolated in separate ice segments, how breath could be slowed without ending life, how temperature shifts could induce near pain without fatality. Each session was longer, colder, and more exacting, and the frost around him seemed to respond to his presence, forming geometric patterns that mirrored his intentions. Novak, now both mentor and terrified witness, documented these sessions meticulously, realizing that Elias was no longer a boy experimenting for knowledge. He was a mind perfecting a philosophy of methodical cruelty. The village continued in ignorance. To them, Elias appeared pale, withdrawn, and painfully ordinary, a quiet teenager who never lingered in public spaces. Yet beneath that unremarkable exterior, a predator's mind had been cultivated, patient, calculating, and precise, hiding in plain sight while shaping a world where control rather than death was the ultimate demonstration of power. By the end of this year, Elias had become a hidden architect of frozen terror, his mind fully formed, waiting for a stage large enough to measure the full extent of his chilling abilities. By 19, Elias had begun testing the limits of human observation itself. The crypt had evolved into a meticulous laboratory of suspended life, where frost and water obeyed his will with a precision that seemed unnatural, almost supernatural. Small animals were no longer the only subjects. He experimented with plants, capturing leaves mid-sway, flowers frozen mid-bloom, testing how long fragile life could remain suspended without losing its essence. Each experiment was a study in control, patience, and observation, a ritualistic process executed with quiet, terrifying focus. Novak watched, both fascinated and horrified, as the boy's detachment from ordinary human emotion became absolute. Elias measured reactions, noted subtle shifts in position or expression, and recorded every detail in exacting notes, his mind absorbing the mechanics of suspension as if it were a language of its own. Outside, the village whispered of strange occurrences. Ponds that froze overnight, frost patterns forming in impossible shapes, birds and small animals found motionless yet alive. No one suspected Elias. To them he remained the pale, withdrawn boy who avoided the sun and crowds. Yet the crypt, with its lattices of ice and channels of suspended life, became a reflection of a mind that had mastered cruelty as an art form. Elias's adolescence had culminated in the creation of a hidden, silent dominion, a world entirely his own, where control eclipsed empathy and every living being could be meticulously manipulated without leaving a trace of the horror visible to ordinary eyes. By 20, Elias had begun to expand his experiments beyond isolated subjects into more complex systems, testing interactions, patterns, and responses across multiple creatures simultaneously. The crypt had grown into a labyrinth of shallow pools, troughs, and suspended channels, each designed to explore a specific principle of his frozen dominion. Birds perched mid-flight, insects frozen in mid-air, small mammals confined in delicate lattices of frost, each arrangement calculated to test limits of endurance, reaction, and awareness. Elias observed them as one would study a complex mechanism, noting how each responded to changes in temperature, pressure, or exposure, cataloging every subtle movement and tremor with meticulous precision. His psychological transformation had become profound. Detachment from human empathy was complete. He no longer experienced guilt, fear, or hesitation. Novak, now both mentor and silent witness, recognized that the boy's mind had evolved into something singular, a combination of cold intellect, obsession, and methodical cruelty. The rituals surrounding his experiments, tracing geometric patterns in frost, layering ice in precise sequences, timing freezes with exacting patience, revealed not randomness but a philosophy, a worldview in which control, not destruction, defined power. Outside, the village remained oblivious. Frost appeared in impossible places, ponds froze unnaturally overnight, and animals were found motionless yet alive. But no one connected these events to Elias. He had perfected the art of hiding monstrosity behind innocence, cultivating a quiet presence while a hidden, frozen dominion of suffering and control grew beneath the surface. By the end of this year, the young man was no longer just a boy with an unusual gift. He had become a methodical architect of terror, patient, precise, and entirely hidden, shaping a world that would eventually reveal the full depth of his chilling capabilities. By 20, Elias had begun to expand his experiments beyond isolated subjects into more complex systems, testing interactions, patterns, and responses across multiple creatures simultaneously. The crypt had grown into a labyrinth of shallow pools, troughs, and suspended channels, each designed to explore a specific principle of his frozen dominion. Birds perched mid-flight, insects frozen in mid-air, small mammals confined in delicate lattices of frost, each arrangement calculated to test limits of endurance, reaction, and awareness. Elias observed them as one would study a complex mechanism, noting how each responded to changes in temperature, pressure, or exposure, cataloging every subtle movement and tremor with meticulous precision. His psychological transformation had become profound. Detachment from human empathy was complete. He no longer experienced guilt, fear, or hesitation. Novak, now both mentor and silent witness, recognized that the boy's mind had evolved into something singular, a combination of cold intellect, obsession, and methodical cruelty. The rituals surrounding his experiments, tracing geometric patterns in frost, layering ice in precise sequences, timing freezes with exacting patience, revealed not randomness but a philosophy, a worldview in which control, not destruction, defined power. Outside, the village remained oblivious. Frost appeared in impossible places, ponds froze unnaturally overnight, and animals were found motionless yet alive. But no one connected these events to Elias. He had perfected the art of hiding monstrosity behind innocence, cultivating a quiet presence while a hidden, frozen dominion of suffering and control grew beneath the surface. By the end of this year, the young man was no longer just a boy with an unusual gift. He had become a methodical architect of terror, patient, precise, and entirely hidden, shaping a world that would eventually reveal the full depth of his chilling capabilities. By 21, Elias had begun to experiment with larger-scale manipulations, extending his frozen dominion into the natural world surrounding the village. Streams and shallow rivers fell silent under his touch, ripples held mid-motion, leaves suspended in arcs that defied gravity, and the cold seemed to spread outward like a deliberate, invisible extension of his will. Novak observed from the shadows, heart heavy with dread, as the boy orchestrated these experiments with the calm detachment of a mind that had long abandoned human morality. Each living creature, each droplet of water became part of a complex system designed to test endurance, suspension, and obedience to Elias's will. He layered frost in intricate patterns, choreographing interactions that transformed life into a precise frozen tableau, a silent demonstration of his absolute control. Psychologically, Elias had become entirely impervious to empathy or hesitation. Where once his curiosity had been tinged with hesitation, now it was purely clinical, driven by an obsession with order, precision, and mastery. Novak realized that the boy's mind had evolved into a philosophy of cruelty, to impose control without immediate destruction, to study and dominate life as a living instrument. The rituals, tracing frost patterns on walls, aligning droplets in perfect lattices, timing freezes to exact seconds, revealed a meticulous methodology and internal logic that elevated suffering into a deliberate art. The village remained unaware. To them, Elias was quiet, unassuming, pale, and withdrawn. Yet beneath that ordinary exterior, a hidden dominion of suspended life had taken root, a silent, cold kingdom where every living being was subject to his precise, methodical manipulation. By the end of this year, Elias had fully become a mind capable of extraordinary cruelty, patient, disciplined, and hidden in plain sight, preparing for a world that had no understanding of the frozen terror lurking just beyond ordinary perception. By 22, Elias had begun to explore the psychological dimensions of his control, turning his attention to the reactions of those who unknowingly brushed against his frozen influence. He experimented not only with animals or plants, but with subtle traces in the village. Windows frosting inexplicably, wells developing thin, crystalline layers overnight, small puddles in courtyards that remained suspended long after the sun rose. Each minor disruption became a measure of his growing dominion, a test of perception and fear without revealing his presence. Novak, now fully aware of the boy's transformation into something singularly chilling, documented everything with mounting unease, understanding that Elias was constructing a world in which ordinary human experience was malleable, subject to his silent command. Elias's rituals had become obsessive and intricate. He traced frost into labyrinthine patterns across floors, walls, and water surfaces, sometimes leaving geometric signatures that seemed to pulse with invisible life. The boy experimented with layered friezes, suspending multiple subjects in interconnected lattices, each life linked in delicate balance, a precise study of cause, effect, and endurance. His detachment from emotion was absolute. Curiosity had replaced conscience, and mastery of suspension had become an art form in itself. Outside the crypt, villagers whispered rumors of strange frost, inexplicable cold, and motionless creatures found along paths or in fields. Yet no one suspected the quiet, pale boy who wandered among them, keeping his eyes down, speaking little, appearing ordinary. Beneath that surface, Elias had become a fully realized architect of frozen terror, a mind capable of blending innocence with deliberate cruelty, constructing a hidden kingdom where control eclipsed empathy, and life itself became a tool for study, manipulation, and the methodical expression of a chilling, patient intelligence. By 23, Elias had begun to integrate time itself into his experiments, testing not only the suspension of life, but the endurance of perception. He would freeze droplets in midair above animal or plant subjects for days, observing subtle changes in posture, breathing, or leaf alignment, noting which patterns held longer, which succumbed to unseen forces, and which could be extended with careful layering of frost and cold. The crypt had become a cathedral of his obsession, its walls lined with shallow channels, lattices, and frozen pools, each reflecting a fragment of his calculating mind. Novak, increasingly anxious, realized that the boy's detachment from ordinary humanity had grown into something far darker, a philosophy of methodical control, where life was neither sacred nor disposable, but an instrument for understanding, shaping, and demonstrating dominance. The rituals surrounding his work were now rigid, precise, almost liturgical. Elias would trace frost across surfaces in geometries that mirrored the positions of his subjects, timing each freeze and thaw to exact intervals, creating a choreography of suspended life that existed entirely on his terms. Every experiment reinforced his belief that mastery over living systems rather than destruction was the ultimate measure of power. Outside, the village continued unaware. Frost appeared in impossible places, birds were found frozen mid-flight, and small creatures were discovered motionless but alive. To ordinary eyes, Elias remained the pale, quiet young man who avoided attention, hiding a mind that had perfected a hidden dominion. By the end of this year, he had become a fully realized force of methodical, patient terror, a boy whose intellect and control had outgrown ordinary understanding, preparing silently for a future where the world itself could feel the weight of his deliberate frozen influence. The first time the village truly felt the weight of Elias's control, it was subtle and almost imperceptible. Morning arrived, but the air carried a strange, unnatural chill that clung to skin and bone. Ponds that should have melted under the rising sun remained glazed with thin, brittle ice, and frost traced itself along door frames and window panes in patterns that seemed almost purposeful, almost intentional. Villagers whispered uneasily of the cold that lingered too long, the stillness of animals that should have moved, the way their breath hung in the air like suspended smoke. No one suspected the quiet young man who walked among them, pale and unremarkable, whose eyes never lingered, but who watched everything with a detached intensity. Elias's experiments had matured into an art of psychological domination. He orchestrated his frozen tableau not only for study, but to imprint a subtle terror, a creeping unease that grew in the minds of those who lived near him. Every animal frozen mid-movement, every suspended droplet, every unnatural pattern of frost was a message. Life itself was subject to his precise will. Novak, who had borne witness to decades of methodical cruelty, now understood the terrifying truth. Elias's genius was in concealment. He did not strike openly. He imposed control silently, invisibly, teaching the village a fear it could neither name nor confront. By the end of this year, the hidden psychopath had revealed the full extent of his dominion. Villagers reported mysterious deaths, strange disappearances, and inexplicable frost phenomena, but none could trace it to Elias. His influence extended beyond ice and suspended life. It had become a quiet philosophy, a lesson in how evil can operate in silence, how control can be the ultimate power, and how a mind perfected for cruelty can remain hidden behind a mask of innocence. Institutions would later codify laws to protect children and observe unusual patterns of environmental anomalies, and memorials would acknowledge the victims whose lives were silently manipulated, but the lessons of Elias Marek endured as a chilling reflection on human oversight. Even now, the frozen dominion he left behind stands as a reminder. Evil does not always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it waits, patient, methodical, and hidden, shaping the world in ways only a few can perceive. What do you think? Could this happen again?